Lord our Father, we thank you for being with us, and we thank you for this opportunity of entering into the mystery of our faith and of opening our hearts to the teaching of Pope Francis. We ask you to give us your guidance, to allow us to enter into the mystery of this document, and also to come to a greater awareness of the role of the Church's social teaching. We pray for wisdom, we pray for understanding, and we pray for the grace to listen to one another in order to grow and to learn in our faith. We ask you to bless us through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thanks very much for the invitation to come back to Kilmarnock. It's always great to come back home. My mother was delighted, so we had a chance to come and see her as well, so that was great. This evening, that's basically, I have been asked to talk a wee bit about the fourth chapter of the Pope's document, and no problem. We're just about to start. The fourth chapter of the document, and it's all to do with the social dimension. But first of all, what I'd like to do, the idea is the social dimension of evangelisation. But the question is, to whom shall we raise our hats? What we're going to do though is give an overview, basically an introduction, then looking at the world today. First of all, we're going to understand the social dimension. We've got to understand what's the context of that. So we have the world today. How does the church connect with the world of today? Then what is the actual gospel message for the church in the world of today? Then who are the people that this message, social message, has got to be transmitted to, and then how can we practically do that and bring all that together? So that's the intention, if we can do that. That's what the Pope asks us to do within that particular chapter. But first of all, to set the context, I think I'd just like to begin with a story. And the story has to do with a large white man who is dressed in black clerical dress as he walks briskly towards his destination. And as he walks, he notices a black woman and her child who are standing in the veranda of a small house, and as this man walks along, he raises his hat to greet that woman. Now, the occurrence of this man raising his hat to this black woman in the childhood of Desmond Tutu made a huge impression on him, because in the eyes of the world, that woman who was black and illiterate was a non-existent entity. She was his mother, but she didn't count for anything in the world. But he was astonished that a white man could actually raise his hat to a black woman. Such things didn't happen in real life. And to quote Desmond Tutu himself, of that occasion he says, "To the very depth of my being, it helped me to realise that we were precious to God and to this white man. Perhaps it helped me not to become anti-white, despite the cruel treatment we encountered from most of them." And the white man was Father Trevor Huddleston, who was an Anglican priest who worked in South Africa from 1943 to 1956 and was hugely active in the resistance against apartheid. And with this gesture, though, of raising his hat, he crossed enormous barriers. The hat at that time, as it is now, wasn't just an item of clothing. It was something else, because it had more than a functional meaning. A hat designated the status group that a person belonged to or that one didn't belong to. In our Western society, a gentleman wore a hat and the man in the street wore a cap. And so with this gesture, Trevor Huddleston expressed deep, deep respect for Desmond Tutu and for his mother. He literally and figuratively saw her standing there, saw her as a woman, respected her and acknowledged her. He expressed respect and value for her as a person. What I'd like to do this evening, as we look at what Pope Francis is saying in chapter 4 of Evangelii Gaudium, is recognise that that is all about us today raising our hats in a way that promotes greater appreciation and value for people in the world of today. What Pope Francis is asking us to do as the community today is look around and raise our hats to acknowledge and to value people. The social dimension of the gospel is about us as individuals and as church raising our hats. That's our challenge. So, first of all, how do we do that? Well, let's acknowledge the world in which we live. What is the world in which we are living today, and the priorities that are changing that we recognise and that the Pope recognises as the context for our evangelisation, or our new evangelisation, which this is all about. First of all, we do need to acknowledge that the world we are living in is a world where we are being challenged to raise our hats. The gospel, in order to be enculturated, has got to be aware of what these cultures are. And so we have to recognise what are the culture that we live in, and how can that culture be transformed in order to be a culture of the gospel. And perhaps we're looking at the world today and looking at the world in which we live in. The greatest situation for us to acknowledge is that situation of secularism. And we're acknowledging that throughout the document, that the secular world is something which is the context that our new evangelisation will have to connect with. If we want to build up the kingdom and allow God's kingdom to be inbuilt, then the culture in which we live and this secular culture is significant. With secularism then, religion is relegated to a purely private sphere. That's what secularism does. It puts religion into the private, and there's no longer any appreciation for ideas. It's only facts that matter. So in the whole culture of secularism, it's facts rather than vision and ideas. So that's the context we're working from. And in this secular idea, God, who's out there but is to be avoided, God is not part of the equation in secularism. But even worse than avoiding God is the elimination of God. And that's part of the whole idea of making God a total irrelevance in our world of today. That secularism will do that. It will make an irrelevance of God. The idea is God doesn't exist. And we can act as if God is not existing. That's our context. That's where the good news has got to be proclaimed and lived out and understood. So with secularism, that idea that let's live as if God doesn't exist, the worldview has changed. God no longer is in the equation for many people in their understanding, and that's the people with whom we must connect. So with God excluded from the picture, the human person becomes the sole focus, and the human person becomes the centre of existence, and the human person becomes the master of his or her existence. And that's a different mindset from a religious mindset. Primacy now within the secular context is given solely to the individual. Okay, so we're looking at that understanding from the viewpoint of an individual person. So secularism reduces God, alienates God, dismisses God, and the human person is the only thing that matters, and the facts about that person. And alongside the whole notion of secularism is a globalisation, and that's a significant aspect which connects with secularism and the whole globalisation experience that Francis refers to throughout the document, because globalisation within that context can really threaten the credibility of the gospel in the same way as secularism can threaten the credibility of the gospel. Globalisation here, though, is understood as a market ideology which spreads the propaganda that the global market will save the world through unlimited growth. That's globalisation, the global market. And unless we buy into that whole notion of unlimited growth, then we're not going to be saved. The myth in globalisation and that whole context of the market ideology is that all that matters is being productive. All that matters is that things grow all the time. And you hear it in the news all the time. If it's not growth, it's disaster. Production, growth, increase. That's globalisation myth, which is there. The global market, therefore, becomes the central focus. That global market of further production is there. And it affects not only the economy, but it affects culture. It affects religion. It affects the environment. It affects creation, that mindset. Bigger is better, more is more. Even got to the church with our census a couple of weeks ago. I'll not tell you how many people came to Mass in Gatehouse of Fleet or Castledon or Kirkcudbright, because we're not in the business of numbers. But it's difficult when everything else is about productivity, everything else is about growth. There's got to be something else. There's got to be value. There's got to be relationship. There's got to be service. That's what Francis is asking us to open up to. The effects of globalisation then have really become noticed in increased unemployment and hunger. As a world, this whole movement towards greater production and market economy and greater force has given us a world which is totally unequal, where the rich are becoming richer, where the poor are becoming poorer, and this gulf is just getting deeper and deeper and deeper. That's the effects of globalisation. We have increased unemployment. We do have hunger. Globalisation is that context, is that myth which is there to promote the whole experience of what life is about, doesn't support the local, doesn't foster community, but rather seeks to dominate and control in a way which spreads uniformity and which really does reject any notion of diversity. Globalisation is this idea, it's Coca-Cola all over the world. That's what matters. Local is rejected. Diversity is seen as bad. Uniformity is seen as good. So globalisation needs to be challenged in the same way as secularism needs to be challenged with a message of the gospel. And that's what the Pope has done. He's given us a message of the gospel which can challenge those two particular aspects of life in which we live today. So, if that's the context, what does Pope Francis tell us about the church in order to counteract secularism and globalisation? Well, the church is changing as well, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to embrace that and recognise that. So, if the culture of our society is one which requires adaptation and understanding, so does our understanding of church. Nowadays, the majority of Christians either are living in or have their origins in the global south and east. That's the fact. We are no longer a Western church. That's it. And that's where we are in church, and we have to accept that, and we're moving beyond that. You know, when Father Boland was talking a couple of weeks ago, he stressed that as well. He spoke about Pope Benedict's understanding, very much rooted in European understanding of church. And with Pope Francis, we not only have the symbol of the leader of the community from the south, but that's the reality of that, a different mindset. So that mindset of where the church is just now, the global south and the east. There is a decline in the number of Christians in many Western countries, particularly in Europe, and those statistics are borne out. And there's a consequent withdrawal of significant portions of the population from religious institutions. You can see that all over Europe, that the religious institutions are declining, and that there's a whole sense of contradiction which is taking place there. We also see within Europe and beyond that migration is changing the landscape of Christianity. The effects of migration are enormous, and migration is one of the good things as well as one of the difficulties, but it's changing our understanding of Christianity. We now live in a multi-religious and a multicultural context. That's where we are. That's what is given to us, and somehow that has its effects for us. So in the light of this picture of our society, and this picture of our church, what is Pope Francis asking of us? What's he saying? How do we connect? How do we engage with that in order that the gospel message becomes alive? Well, the answer offered is this new evangelisation. The Pope is carrying on from what Pope Benedict has offered us with the promotion of new evangelisation. But to think that a new evangelisation can be brought about by a renewal of past forms is simply an illusion. We can't just look to the past in order to repeat our mistakes. New evangelisation requires a new message. It requires something to be new. And that's the whole challenge that Pope Francis offers us. So we cannot allow ourselves, in order to engage with the world today, to live with that illusion that our language of faith can be understood and accepted to the same extent as it was previously, simply by repeating the same things from time to time. We can't just repeat the past. We must do something else. What we're being called to do then is proclaim a gospel message which renews, which is effective, which is faithful to that which was lived and proclaimed by Jesus himself, and which is compelling to the individuals in the 21st century. That's what's been invited to, that's what's been offered to us, and that's the challenge. And that's the wonderful challenge which we have in the church of today. And so this new experience, this new evangelisation, it's not so much about content as it is the way in which the message and the proclamation is to be conducted. Because each of us and our contemporaries live in a new context, so the new context will have to have its effects on us. So if the message of new evangelisation is to counterbalance secularism and globalisation, somehow what we've been asked to recognise is it's offering us a concrete call to social responsibility. It's a social responsibility which will counter secularism and globalisation in the way in which it's been portrayed. The message of social responsibility, which comes from Jesus, the message of social responsibility as proclaimed and lived by the church, it is the same message, but we have to present it in a different way because we're living in a different context and the situation requires a different understanding. So what is the call that Pope Francis challenges to then? Social responsibility. What is the social responsibility required of the 21st century? Well, basically, it's the gospel message. It's the gospel message in order to connect with the 21st century. And the gospel message, at its most basic, is a message about human dignity. The starting point of reflecting on anything to do with the social dimension of the gospel and the social responsibility of followers of Jesus has to be a foundation in the dignity of the human person. That's the Church's social teaching is rooted in the dignity of the human person. We are being called to recognise and to respect all people. And that demands a radical appreciation of the human dignity of all people. Again, it's nothing new, but it has to be portrayed in a different context. How do we connect and how do we let people know that their dignity is respected? All people are worthy of being treated with dignity. All people are created in the image of God. It goes back to Genesis chapter 1. Every human being matters. And Pope Francis is bringing that out all the time he opens his mouth. Every single human being matters, regardless of gender, intelligence, economic power, age, ethnic background, nationality, or any other criteria. Every single human being is created by God, loved by God, and demands and deserves dignity. That means that every human being is entitled to life and is entitled to the possibilities of taking part in society. Every human being. And we know in our shame that there are numerous historical and current examples of how as a church we've not always recognised and acknowledged people as human beings, and that has to change. That's part of our new evangelisation. And one of the main ways it will change is by changing our attitudes and our actions principally to those who are on the margins. And that's what Pope Francis is inviting us to do with that context of new evangelisation and social responsibility, is recognise the people on the margins. One of the major shifts then in Pope Francis's teaching is the central focus that those who are on the margins must now take in the church. The church of the today must have those in the margins at the centre. Ministry is therefore no longer to the margins. The church has not been asked to go out to the people on the margins, but rather ministry and church is from the margins. It's that mindset which has got to take place. That's what the Pope is asking us to embrace. The privileged place for encountering God is not a position of power. The privileged place for encountering God today is from the margins. Now we know that the church at its best has always cared for the poor, for the sick, for the elderly, for widows, for orphans, for the handicapped, for the homeless and refugees. We know the church at its best does that. But these are the people who must again be the focus for the church. These are the people who must be central in a way which is developed, in a way which is new, and it's a way which recognises their human dignity and the centrality that they have in the proclamation of the gospel. So this vision will have implications then for how we view status. The last will be first and the first will be last. What's that mean? We've got to change our mindset about what's important, who are important. Power. Again, we've got it, it's the same message. It's not about ruling, but it's about serving. And also the implications how we use our money, how we use our goods, because it's about sharing rather than hoarding. Simple messages which are there, but it's just been repeated and given a context and just been put before us in order to be the blueprint for us to follow. So if we're to be a church today that raises her hat, then we must recognise and we must notice people who, according to popular opinion today, don't count. People on the margins. Seeing and recognising those at the margins is going to then require a manner of compassion, of mercy, and of sensitivity. For Pope Francis, these are the marks of the church. These are the marks that will manifest ourselves as Christians of today. Compassion, mercy, sensitivity. That's the new evangelisation. Living that out, how do we do it? Can we be practical? Are there practical steps for living out the new evangelisation? Are there practical ways in which we can effect this social responsibility which we're being challenged to put into practice? Well, in order to get the practical steps, who are the people who are often unconsciously excluded from society? We've got to challenge ourselves and listen to what that's saying, especially when we define people in terms of economic productivity, of performance success, of health and youthfulness, all those attributes which are there. If we can go beyond that, who are being excluded? Who are the individuals within society that demand our attention? Who are the people excluded because they have insufficient access to work, insufficient access to education, insufficient transportation, insufficient income? That's what we have to put our energies into. Who are the people within our society with disabilities, physical and mental disability? The Pope's exhortation challenges us to explore our options with regard to those who are poor, those who are sick, to the handicapped, the lonely, the mourning, the migrants, the refugees, including illegal refugees, to asylum seekers, to the homeless, to to the drug and other addicts, those with psychiatric problems, prisoners in this Prisoners' Week, ex-prisoners, the dying, full-time carers, those who suffer because of dementia. The list is endless. There are so many people on the margins of society that are there in order to minister and be ministered to. It also then requires us that we open our minds and open our hearts beyond simply the local, to situations of global poverty, to fight against discrimination and oppression in any form as part of the new evangelisation, to support the marginalised throughout the world is the call of evangelisation, and to stop environmental destruction. The Pope is supposed to be producing an encyclical on the environment, which will be due out in 2015. It could have an enormous effect on the new evangelisation, where we go, where we put our priorities. Listen to the news today with the fracking and things like that. There's lots of environmental issues that we have to look at as part of the new evangelisation, where we are with there. But environmental destruction is a question for us. So the Pope's call to evangelisation challenges us to be available to others, to be hospitable, to be loyal and to stay with people, not to give up. That's how we proclaim the new evangelisation. Compassion and hospitality and remaining in there. We've got to go beyond seeing the poor and the vulnerable as those people with deficiencies, as people who are lacking in skills, as people who lack morals or lack motivation, as lazy, as burdensome, as those who are a burden on the rest of us financially and socially, those who don't contribute to society. We've got to go beyond that mindset. The social dimension of evangelisation challenges us, therefore, to resist that temptation that is within us to say it's their own fault. Simply because people cannot conform to rules that we have made, we cannot be judgmental of them. We have to reject them in our whole process of new evangelisation what the prevailing economic thinking takes as productive. And instead, we are being invited and challenged to value and support all that's important in society and important to society, including care work, the raising of children, values. How do we promote values? As individuals and as a church, we need to take a critical look at ourselves and ask the difficult questions. Are the poor given a voice in the church? Is the parish an inclusive community? Is proper attention being paid to the needs of the world? Is sufficient effort being made at structural change? Are ecological factors taken into account in our own consumptive behaviour? And do we support policies that save energy and save water? Questions which affect us, which are part of our social responsibility. The social dimension then of the gospel, it demands that we also become more aware of all those individuals that are there. Recognising that's part of our story. It must become who we are. It also demands that one of the issues we spoke about, the environmental thing, climate change is important, and it's something which is part of the gospel message. The effects of climate change, the scientists will tell us, are getting worse, and because of that, the world's poorest are suffering the most because of it. And it's one of the issues of society that the church is challenging us to be aware of. While climate change affects everyone, it's the rich countries whose unsustainable economic paths are the root cause of it. It's us. We are the rich. We have to challenge ourselves about that. We must bear the greatest responsibility for resolving the problems of climate change and the difficulties which will happen if there's rising tides and countries in the global south are getting wiped out. It's our responsibility with it. Recent research strongly affirms that humans are most likely responsible for the bulk of global warming in recent years, and its impact on global warming on food production is incredibly harmful to the smallholder farmers in the developing countries. That's the people that are suffering most. So by looking at the situation, by the Pope asking us to open our minds and our hearts to that whole reality, then we're going to be looking at difficult situations. But it's important, there's something powerful about that, the impact that it has. And our challenges, what can we do? What small steps can we make to become more aware, to become more insightful, to become more knowledgeable about exclusion and about poverty that other people do suffer? We also have been challenged in the new evangelisation. Pope Francis has challenged us to be prepared to consider what I, as an individual, can and cannot do. And also, collectively, what we can and cannot do. And there's lots of ways in which we can do it. And the Pope invites us as consumers, as producers, as participants in social, political organisations. We have a voice, and we are being challenged to be part of that political scenario. It's society, it's social. Again, religion is not divorced from society. We must have a voice within that society in order to have that experience faced up to of the global south, those who are being exploited, and the poor and underdeveloped. That's the picture that we're being encouraged to engage with. So, to bring it all together, here are we. What does chapter 4 of Evangelii Gaudium say to us? Well, the challenge of this particular document is about drawing us closer to the person of Jesus Christ. First and foremost, it's about that relationship with Jesus and living as Jesus did, as witnessing to our faith in Jesus as the one who offers us meaning and salvation, and showing that only Jesus is the Saviour of the human race. Only Jesus has the answer to this question of how can we be saved. The Pope believes in the power of grace to transform us as individuals, and the power of grace to transform us as communities, and the power of grace to transform us as institutions. And we can see already that with his leadership, the power of grace transforming the church. Our mode of expressing the good news must correspond somehow better to the society and the cultural context of today. We just have to do that if the gospel message is to be relevant and is to be credible. We've got to identify clearly where appropriate pastoral action can take place. The context is there. We must identify how we are going to address that. The evangelisation we've been invited to cannot be conducted unilaterally, but it requires ecumenical commitment and interreligious dialogue, as well as encountering and dialogue and meeting with those who do not believe at all. And Pope Francis is very strong. Ecumenism must be at the forefront, interreligious dialogue, which is very good because next week is Scottish Interfaith Week, 23rd of November to the 30th of November, and the Bishops' Conference have put out a wee handout about the importance of interreligious dialogue, encouraging interreligious dialogue. So it's very appropriate, but it's something we have to recognise, acknowledge, and be part of ecumenism, our Christian unity, but also in this multicultural society, interreligious dialogue. It's interesting, I'm the chaplain at St Joseph's College in Dumfries, and recently as part of the chaplaincy team there, we have an interreligious dimension because a number of the pupils at the school are Muslim, and so that's part of the interreligious faith, which is great, as it should be, as a Catholic school, being faithful to the guidance of our own bishops and the teaching of Pope Francis. So, interreligious dialogue, very important. We also need to be open to a fruitful exchange of traditions which are complementary to our own tradition, but also which can be difficult for us to engage with. Because ultimately, the new evangelisation, it's not about a programme. It's not about doing something. It's about this person, Jesus Christ. And it's about our belonging to the community of Christ that motivates us and gives us that energy to allow the kingdom of God to be built up. It's about making sense of our own personal identity through this commitment and service to Jesus and his community and the world which has been created. If we go back to Trevor Huddleston at the very beginning, he raised his hat and he evangelised Desmond Tutu at a very young age. We now have to do the same as individuals, as parish communities, as diocesan community and as universal church. We must raise our hats. That is the challenge of new evangelisation. There are some wonderful resources to help. In addition to Pope Francis, just a couple of things about the social teaching of the church. The best resource we have is a compendium of the social doctrine of the church, which was produced by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. Brings together all the major themes that we have in our church's social teaching and brings it together in a reflective manner. Wonderful. So I'll leave this here, we look at it. This one here has just come out. It's from an English sociologist, I think he's, sociologist, Michael Hornsby Smith. And a number of years ago, he wrote a wonderful book on Catholic social teaching. It's quite dense. It's just unfortunate. Cardinal O'Brien is in the front page of it. You spend all your life doing a book, and Cardinal. So he did this book, and it was wonderful, but it's quite intense. So what he's now done is a kind of summary of it in letters form to his grandchildren. He takes all the major points of the Church's social teaching and addresses them to his grandchildren in a very, very readable manner. But he asks how can they put into practice the things that we've been talking about tonight. Highly, highly recommend it, especially for those of you who are grandparents. You might like to talk to your grandchildren about some of the points that he raises. But he just puts in very, very easy to understand language all the important issues of the Church's social teaching. So, recommend for those who wish to go further, having read Pope Francis's document. So, the floor is open for clarifications, disagreements, whatever. Yes?
I'm almost a wee bit frightened to say this in case I'm totally misunderstood. The issue about globalisation. I'm confused because my idea was that the Pope wasn't necessarily saying that globalisation is necessarily wrong, providing the growth that comes from it is more equally and fairly distributed.
But what I was saying, what is wrong is the globalisation is only about market growth. That kind of idea. The whole idea of recognising globalisation as the movement of an equal world is that's a different concept of globalisation. This is market globalisation. But the whole idea that we are a world church is true, is good. You know, that we are part of a global community. But if that global community is only about being the same because you're motivated by market forces, then it's wrong. Because the dignity of the human person is not at the forefront. It's market economy that's moving, that's motivated. Yep.
You didn't mention anything about the media in your presentation tonight. I don't know, I haven't read the whole document. I don't know if it's mentioned elsewhere in the document. I think so much of the media today is poisonous. It's blaming the poor for all the economic problems, all the difficulties. It's constantly full of stories of so-called swindlers, etc. Which might exist, but that's not the point. The whole attitude of so much of the media, even the BBC, the BBC slant things that allow us to disrespect the poor and marginalised. I think that point should be made very strongly. If you read the Daily Mail day after day after day, you find a certain view of the world which is just at variance with Christianity.
Sure. Got to what I gave a sermon one day, and I mentioned the Daily Telegraph. I said, not that I said someone had given me an article to read. He said I wouldn't read the Daily Telegraph, and someone harangued me after mass, because they read the Daily Telegraph, and I was criticising them. So got to watch what they're saying. But yeah, I can see what you're saying. The whole concept. But what the Pope is saying is that we have got to have somehow to make sure that that's not the agenda which is directing us. That's the agenda which is directing us. It's the agenda of dignity. It's the agenda of raising our hearts. It's not the agenda of condemnation. And that's as the new evangelisation and the new evangelisers, that's our challenge. Was it that bad? You need to talk among yourselves. After that. Danny, what's for you?
I think we're taking in all that you say. I think our collective problem is actually how we, as a community in St Matthew's, can practically go about this. I think that's the next step that we need to look at. I think.
Yeah, but as a community of St Matthew's, you've been doing it for years.
Yes, yes.
If any community has been doing that, St Matthew's community has been doing it. So how do you build on what you've been doing in the past? It's not as if saying, oh, you've got to start building everything from scratch. You're building what's there.
Yes.
And that's the important thing, because St Matthew's is giving tremendous witness and has done. But then it's up to the community of St Matthew's and the other communities to come together to do that.
But do we all really believe this? That's the question. Do we all really commit to that? And I'm not sure if we do. I think we have made religion a private thing as well. The church has, the people who come to church have to a certain extent.
And it's easier to kind of
absolutely.
look at the internal workings of the church and talk about and do a talk about the mass translation and all that kind of stuff. That's a lot easier. Then I got a lot of questions then.
Yes.
People will be kind of asking lots of things. But if we go out of our comfort zone a wee bit, it's a challenge.
That's it.
And it's exactly the same for us as priests.
Yes.
And that's why Pope Francis is an enormous challenge to a lot of priests, which is great.
And what we did over the years was we internalised ministries as well. We had leaders and we had altar servers and we had Eucharistic ministers, and these were encouraged and they all were inward looking,
But what's interesting, if we're going to the margins, and we're allowing the margins to minister to us, that's where the power is, that's where the direction should come from.
Yes.
That's a huge change. And what that means for us as church.
Well, I don't want to give away my homily for the weekend.
Oh, don't do that, man.
And I certainly don't want to give you a homily too. But when I was, so this weekend is Christ King, and the gospel is, when the Son of Man comes, it's going in all his glory, because when I was hungry, you gave me food, etc., etc. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison. And it just struck me this morning that these are the essential things. That is I think the gospel is telling us that those are the essential things. And for many years as a church, we have looked inwards. Looking inwards is important. Get the liturgy respectful and everything that we do as a community. But going out is at the heart of what the new evangelisation is possibly about.
It's a culture of compassion. I was hungry and you fed me, I was sick and you visited me, I was in prison and you came to see me, I was naked and you clothed me. It's compassion. And what Pope Francis is doing is just reminding us, and that is the gospel message. But it's up to us how we actually inculturate compassion and mercy. And at its best, the church has always done that. But we have to just renew it, have to do it in a new form, new evangelisation. Which is great, because that was our focus. We now know where we ought to be putting our energies. Tea?
Yep. We tend to try to focus on big events and like the raising of the house, it can just be small things, small individual things. And I think sometimes we expect thanks for everything we do, but why should we? I mean, we should just be doing it for the sake of, not to be acknowledged for it.
Do that, great.
Calls on me to give a wee vote of thanks. I think we're all agreed that we're a privilege to hear such an experienced and distinguished teacher. I had a wee smile to myself when I saw the hat. I've got a hat like that. It's only for the summer. So you need to put bonnets in as well. But you did correct that in the proper context. It was a great context. I love the word context. In your prayer you said the prayer about wisdom and awareness and listening to each other, among other things. And then you went on to talk about secularism and globalisation, the church today, migration, the list of steps that we should all take. Climate change is very important, and the ecumenism. And the context is clearer now, the context of the new thinking from Pope Francis. I think there is new thinking, and you've put it into some context as you were going along. I think that was important. This brings great challenges for the church, and indeed because of that for us. So, but it's been a useful learning curve for us all, I think, as part of this whole course that we've been doing. Well, thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule and all these parishes. I was here taking on with that.
We're on ourselves, Archie, it's okay.
So thank you for your input for this series. So if you join me, thank you.